Hello everyone and welcome to this latest video discussion as part of the RICS Tech Partner Programme. My name is Andrew Knight and I've been with RICS for over 12 years now. I sit within our practice and knowledge and practice. I'll start again. I usually make the mistake occasionally. I'll give it 5 seconds and start again. Hello everyone and welcome to this latest video discussion as part of the RICS Tech Partner Programme. My name is Andrew Knight and I've been with RICS for over 12 years now. I sit within our Knowledge and Practice Directorate and my job is to look at the overall effect of data and technology right across the built and natural environment. And with over 110,000 members working worldwide, right across the property life cycle through land, planning and development, construction, brokerage, valuation, finance, building operation, building surveying, asset management, and end of life. It's a really broad canvas upon which data and technology is having a hugely profound and important impact. And indeed, our members also work across all the major asset types: land itself, residential, commercial, alternative assets and infrastructure. So once again, a huge broad canvas upon which we need to utilize data and tech, gain the opportunities and manage the risks. And I'm really glad today to have Freddie join me from Trustek. So really great to have you on the call, Freddie.
Yeah, thanks very much. Really glad to be part of this and hopefully looking forward to some interesting discussions.
Indeed, indeed. Well, before we get into the bits and bytes and all the kind of interesting outcomes that we can discuss, it's always great to have a bit of a kind of a personal backstory. So it'd be great to hear about your backstory and the origin of Trustek itself.
Yeah, so I started off my career as a chartered surveyor. So I worked as a commercial office broker in central London, which I did for almost a decade, which was a great place to build foundations and get to know the London market. I then had a pretty big pivot in my own career in my late 20s and actually co-founded a PropTech startup. So we built mobile apps and deployed Internet of Things solutions into commercial office buildings and tried to build engaging platforms. Unfortunately, that business didn't survive COVID, which was a bit of a shame for me, but I had a pretty steep learning curve from going from knowing very little about technology to actually sitting in a room full of developers and building mobile apps, and then going to buildings and kind of understanding when the rubber hits the road how challenging it is to actually deploy these technologies and also to gain the user levels adoption. On that journey, I met my business partner, who was the acting head of innovation for Colliers. And actually, we really both spent more time talking about the challenges around PropTech and deployment in the general industry market. And that really was what bore the idea of Trustek. And we launched the business coming up to 3 years ago now. So now we act as independent PropTech consultants. So in your introduction, you gave the brief of the number of surveyors, the cross-sector, the challenges, the things that really face the marketplace. And our job is to help bridge that gap. So to ask pertinent questions of our clients and the owners and operators of buildings, but also of the technology companies that exist in the marketplace, to make sure that we're aligning the needs with the products and actually hoping to manage that process for people to successfully deploy and choose the right products to solve their needs.
So I guess, Freddie, you have the benefit of all those years of experience, but also being on kind of both sides of the fence, if I can use that expression. And obviously there's been this, and I would say a continued explosion in the number of kind of prop tech firms out there, and indeed the way, if I can call them, traditional firms that are digitizing their businesses. I mean, how would you summarize what you've seen in the last 5 or 10 years in terms of how the sector has really reacted to and embraced or not embraced technology? Because it's been an incredibly sort of not so much bumpy journey, I guess, but interesting journey in the sense there's so much going on and so much activity in a sector that's historically been quite conservative with a small c.
Yeah, it's a very broad question to answer. I think there's definitely been some positives and negatives with regards to kind of what's been adopted. I think the real challenge is the speed in which technology changes versus the speed in which buildings change, and actually marrying the needs of what is the asset strategy, what's the building strategy, what's the building needs versus what is currently available in the marketplace. And as you say, there's been a huge growth in so many different verticals within the PropTech space, all trying to vie for time, attention, and essentially cost for these buildings. It's a full-time job for a person in a business to be able to choose, what's our priority right now for this asset, what's the priority for the business, and ultimately what are the customers wanting? Because a huge part of this, which we ran an event ourselves, which was what do occupiers want, and kind of as much of what do they want, what do they need. And really we're seeing quite a lot of, hopefully now, the breaking down of these siloed procurements. So, a product that solves this one point solution for one stakeholder, but actually doesn't benefit another, and trying to really think about holistically what's going to have the biggest impact for typically the lowest cost. And you mentioned the word risk. There's a huge challenge around risk and cybersecurity, without wanting to go into that as a, as a vertical today. But the more things you add, the more vulnerability you have. And really, what's the most important thing for the building, for the business right now? So I don't think, there's definitely some good things and some bad things. I think there's a lot of maturity, specifically in the UK market, which for us, we always want to see people trying things, understanding that even the biggest technology companies in the world have downtime, have breaks, have issues, and kind of getting comfortable with that from a risk perspective. But also a big part of the competitive procurement that we do for clients is kind of helping them understand there are so many things out there that actually, whilst there's not a silver bullet, which we talk about a lot, that will have one product that does everything you need, there's probably going to be a handful of them. It's understanding that, there is risk associated, but actually doing something is always better than nothing. And, being comfortable with that fact that there's going to be a pilot, there's going to be a bit of risk, but ultimately, if it goes well and it's deployed properly, it can have a meaningful impact. And you can potentially find another provider that's a new entrant to the market that can deliver the same solution or more at a lower price point. And whilst it shouldn't always be about cost, it should be about the deployment and the success. Sometimes we've seen legacy solutions added to, so we need a new product. It's like, well, actually the existing product you have can do that if you just use it better. So it's not always about buying new. A lot of the time it's about leveraging what you have better, and that really starts with training and understanding of what these products are, which is one of the biggest challenges we see when it comes to deployment, is the time it takes for the individuals to really get their head around the products they've got and making best use of them. If that's a good enough answer to that question.
So, I mean, you've mentioned a number of kind of challenges probably that the real estate sector has, and I suppose you could define challenges on one area, which is what are their business needs, what are they facing in terms of the needs for running their buildings, the economic factors that are pushing them to do certain things, and the sustainability agenda. So I suppose it's interesting to hear from you what you think those almost drivers of adoption are, and also those kind of areas where, as you've intimated, it's about thousands of products out there. How do you choose? How do you procure? How do you integrate them? And as you say, how do you make the best of what you've already got? And I know you're looking at kind of almost helping the market with a set of sort of verified suppliers. But how would you sort of describe this current landscape of risk, opportunity, needs for the sector with the buildings they're trying to run now?
Well, I suppose our methodology in the way in which you approach kind of most problems that we think is aligned to getting that solution right is understand, select, deploy, and measure. That's sort of our pillars of our logic of our consultancy. And understand for us is actually going into assets and auditing them. So not a financial audit looking through the numbers, but what technologies do you currently have? How far do they go? What are they linked to? Are they being used well? Are the processes well defined? Are you getting the best value out of them right now? That then gives you a gap analysis for things you don't have. And quite often that can be us mentioning technologies which the people on the ground have never heard of or didn't know could be existing, or in more cases than not, they know about them, but they just don't have the time and resources to be able to go and spend that time that's needed to go to market, to listen to the sales pitches, to understand how they work. And that's really where before you start the journey, we need to go and get something to drive our sustainability agenda. It's like, okay, well, how ready are you as a building and a business to be able to actually leverage a piece of technology to get the most value out of it? And do you have something right now that actually could do 40–50% of it without you needing to buy something else? When it comes to selection and procurement, it's really tricky. One of the reasons why we're creating the verified marketplace is we're trying to standardize the information that's made available to real estate. And whilst that might seem really obvious, is that every platform will have different functionality, either a very good front-end user experience or a very strong back-end integration platform. And they'll have different price points. So whether it's CapEx or OpEx, and understanding where's the budgets available for that. Is it a project that's an asset that's going to be traded in the next 6 months or 6 years, or is it going to be a long-term hold where they actually really care about what the 5-year costs are? So once you sort of get a head around what your building's got, understanding what's available, capital, knowledge, resourcing, procurement, we help on that side of it. But where we see all too often the things go wrong is actually in the deployment. So making sure that you've got that very key accountability matrix of what are the technology company going to provide and support, what do my team need to know about, need to use, and need to access, and ultimately where measurement comes in is, how are we going to in a year's time reflect on what we've done as being a success? And that's really where the understand a benchmark of where you are today and what you've got can be measured against something, or the tangible, whether it's we want to improve our energy performance or reduce our energy consumption in the building. Great, that's a great baseline where you are today. Now we're going to go through that process, and in a year's time it's very easy to come back and measure it. The things that are more challenging, specifically around ESG, would be, say, the social indexes or social impact. So there are certain products out there that give you a very clear ROI, and it's a very nice thing to say, we consumed X, we now consume Y. That's a brilliant ROI, thank you very much. But that's not always, customer experience is a huge factor for everyone when it comes to, irrespective of any asset class. How do you measure that today? How is technology going to improve that? Yes, there's an abundance of things out there, but actually, where are you today? And after deploying technology, how can we show value and a return on something that's less tangible? So, as I say, the methodology is how we like to approach the problem, but it's not always as simple as X equals Y and we save money. Then great, we should definitely do it.
So, I mean, leading on from that, and this came out in our tech partner survey that we did at the end of last year, was this sort of list of barriers that still seem to be holding the sector back. And I guess it's an obvious thing to talk about, financial issues, training, educational issues, and obviously I think ROI is clearly very important here. But what are you still seeing as reasons for hesitation, for uncertainty, and actually making the move, taking the plunge almost?
For us, I think the realities within any building is they're very complex, and the complexity leads to an uncertainty about whose job is it and who pays for it. And I think that's one of the things when it comes to that deployment strategy is an assumption that a building owner and a building operator and an occupier, which is the very high level stakeholders, and the technology company, is whose job is it to go and find this technology? Whose job is it to procure it? Whose job is it to run it? Who gets the value of that data? Is it linked to all stakeholders, or is it siloed to this will benefit the asset, the owner, and the value of the asset, but actually won't necessarily benefit the occupiers of the building? And really, with that sort of who's who, it's really hard to then galvanize the accountability for, are you waiting for an occupier to come to a building operator to ask for a piece of technology to be implemented into a building that then goes back up the chain to the landlord or the owner, who then goes, yes, okay, we're happy to procure this? Or on the flip side is, as an owner, I want to give the most amount of options and flexibility to my prospective occupiers or existing ones, so is the onus on me to go and find it? And then, unfortunately, the people in the middle, all too often, the facilities and operating managers, we see a lot of occasions where technology is procured by an owner, given to an operator that's going to interact with the occupiers, and it's a surprise for the occupiers and the owners and the operators, because they're like, I don't really know why we've got it, but I've got it, and I don't really know how to use it. So I think one of the biggest challenges is still on that defining, is the responsibility and knowledge sitting with the owner, fund manager? Is it with the operational team and staff that are going to benefit from it? Or are we waiting for an occupier to come knocking at your door to say, I need this information to help me operate my workspace better? And really, when we ran an event, which was Don't Forget the Occupier, that was one of the biggest challenges is, whose job is it to find this stuff? Whose job is it to implement it? And are we all waiting for the other person to solve the problem or, create the challenge? And that's really where the clients we're fortunate enough to work with, they're the ones that are kind of taking ownership of it, and they want to move it forward. They know they need to do something, but they know that there'll be lots of knocks at the door from technology companies trying to sell them stuff, but actually formulating a strategy of the important and valuable things to them first is kind of the first, the stage of doing it. And making sure you engage with all the relevant stakeholders in that journey is really important, because we see all too often things that will benefit one stakeholder not necessarily communicated to another. And that communication part is really challenging. Like, I was a chartered surveyor for nearly a decade. If you asked me to, back in the day, to give you the value proposition of installing a technology company into a building to an occupier, I would really struggle. Like, that's not part of my skill set. I can't tell you what the benefit of the ROI of a machine learning algorithm running the energy management of a building. It's not something that I was ever trained on or knew about. So, if the expectation is that these people are going to sell the value to someone else, it's really hard for them to do. And so I think for us is to move it forward, you have to somebody has to take the reins, and having a one lead stakeholder, be it the operator, the owner, or an occupier, that person has to come with conviction, knowledge, and patience more often than not to go, actually, this is how we're going to drive it forward, and we need to all go on the journey together. But I think that's one of the challenges we see, is that defining the accountability of who starts the journey, who owns it, and then who communicates the value of it to the wider stakeholder group, which is, unfortunately, there are obviously with all these things good examples and bad ones, but that's one of the biggest challenges we see.
I guess it's interesting so often that technology comes back to actually leadership and people, doesn't it, in terms of actually people driving this in a good way. And I suppose to bring that alive, can you perhaps talk us through some of the kind of client types and opportunities you've worked with, with the approach that you've taken?
Yeah, so I suppose what's probably the best one to go for? I would say around the really exciting things is when we're involved really early on as a digital building consultant. And I think one of the things that we've noticed is the rise of these new consultants in the development strategy. And RIBA produced a new draft proposal to include smart technologists or smart technology as part of that design development journey. And the earlier on you can do it and get it embedded into the logic and thought processes, the easier it is to carry it on. But again, my slight challenge to that is that the operational delivery part of it is still not their problem in construction. And I think there's a few businesses and operators that are doing kind of design for management, where they're bringing that knowledge base and operational knowledge into the design construction considerations. So it's less of, we built this, it does this, good luck running it. Bringing in the people that are going to be looking after the technologies that have been procured at construction stage into operation. That's probably one of the ones that we get excited about, because we can talk about what's relevant today and what's going to be relevant in the future. I think when it comes to existing assets, really for us, going into a trophy asset and looking under the hood of what's there and what's working well and what's not, and then kind of working through the gaps of, okay, we need to improve our ESG credentials, is one of my pet peeves of defining what they are. But if it's we actually want to look at our energy management solution, what have you got today? How can we go to market and find a solution? And interestingly enough, there's lots more things around there in the marketplace using machine learning to be able to automate these processes, but actually not everybody's ready to let go of the people element of it. They still want humans to interact, to have the human accountability to pick up the phone to somebody, as opposed to actually handing it purely over to a piece of software. So it really does depend as far as, when it comes to what are the best outcomes for it from a construction or operation perspective. But increasingly, we're seeing technology form part of that point of difference. And I think customer experience has been a huge factor and a huge growth market for PropTech. But actually defining what the success looks like and when they should think about that is also still a bit of a murky world. But it's really interesting, the similarities between different sectors as well. So we're now doing some work in the build to rent space, but also in the purpose-built student accommodation. And the similarities between the deployment and logic between these two things, because of commercial office spaces wanting to be more operational, less functional. It's really interesting to see how many similarities there are between a customer, a resident versus an occupier. And it's that as a maturity of addressing the needs or preempting the needs is definitely something we're seeing as a positive to drive people and innovation forward within the built environment.
And I think that's very healthy because, all these spaces are occupied by human beings, whether it's built to rent or student accommodation or an office. And I think it's been perhaps a blind spot of the sector to treat offices as purely bricks and mortar and forget that actually it's about the people who occupy them. I mean, I'm going to make an assumption that you're seeing people are becoming more receptive to using technology now. And is there any trend there in terms of size of company or culture, or is it kind of fairly idiosyncratic as to who actually as stakeholders are grasping this and saying, yeah, let's actually use technology to get these outcomes?
It's a very hard thing to answer succinctly. I think there are definitely examples of the larger funds and REITs that have now their own internal team, that they've created their own internal stakeholder group that have done the procurement, are implementing it, are understanding the value and seeing the return on that investment and made the time and effort and capital into technology. There's definitely the smaller end of the spectrum, the individual or a handful of asset owners that know they need to do it, but have to find the time and resourcing to get a value out of it. So they kind of know that they should be doing it, but actually can they find the time within their day job to actually go out there and procure it? So I think there's definitely not necessarily a two-tier market. There's probably a three-tier market where you've got the bigger institutions that have got the resources and human capital internally to drive these things forward and to have standards. You've got the middle layer that are actually potentially a newer, smaller business that are a bit more dynamic, and therefore technology they know needs to form part of it, and they're probably a little bit more less risk averse, so they're more keen to try something new and understand it might not work. But there's definitely still an abundance of people out there that just don't know these things exist and don't know about the value of them and don't necessarily care because they still operate on a bricks and mortar basis, and as long as the building's still standing and the rent's paid, they're pretty relaxed about all the other bells and whistles that come with it. So yeah, that's probably my summary of it. There's no perfect tiered market for it at the moment, but that's really the people we're interacting with, and I hope that with everything that's going on that it will continue to build momentum and grow. But I think there's priority shifting and budget which is changing people's demands.
Now, Freddie, we've touched on the concept of ROI on a number of occasions in this conversation, and obviously it's an obvious statement to say that fundamentally real estate, commercial real estate, whether it's offices or built to rent or student accommodation or retail, is an income producing asset, and obviously there are financial outcomes, and so often ROI will be seen through the lens of maintaining or increasing the value of the asset, maintaining or increasing the rental value, or saving on energy consumption. But are you also seeing people looking at ROI in a broader piece around the kind of social impact, those other kind of dimensions of ESG above and beyond bottom line impact?
Absolutely. I think, as I mentioned earlier, because it's much harder to quantify, it's much harder to drive an aspiration or a measured KPI. We want to do this, but absolutely, I think a lot of the operators we work with are very, very keen to make sure they can, they're driving forward as many initiatives as they can, and they see technology as the ability to quantify it. So I think that's the challenge with anything like this, is that how can we actually prove, report, tell somebody about that we've done this and it's worked and it's been a success. So there's a huge appetite from most buildings. I mean, anecdotally, when we audited assets last year, 60+% of those buildings hadn't ever heard of ESG when we were on site with the individuals. Compare that to this year, and it's the exact opposite. Now it's all but 100% of buildings have got some sort of ESG strategy. So the knowledge that's been passed down from senior management to the in building has definitely been a full 180, which is brilliant to see. But then where they go, where they start, what the priorities are when it comes to saying, social value and contributions to the local area, it's a much harder thing to quantify. But it doesn't stop people's enthusiasm to do it, but they know they need some semblance of technology to be able to benchmark, okay, how much revenue has this building given to local retailers? How do I get that information? How do I know what they've done? Okay, well, let's work and find a way to be able to benchmark that to give a quantifiable, not ROI, but return on impact as opposed to investment. That makes sense.
Yeah. Well, I guess it wouldn't be one of these discussions if I didn't ask you to get your crystal ball out and kind of make some predictions. I mean, where do you think data and tech are going to have the biggest impact? And perhaps not 5-10 years away, but the next 2-3 years, where do you think there's going to be this biggest impact on the sector?
I like to think that with everything that's going on at the moment, ESG is a huge topic and one that's not going away. I think from our perspective is the opportunity of, I mean, probably the low-hanging fruit is moving away from considering a building in construction to understanding the operation and the journey the building needs to go on to get to net zero. I think from the appetite and conversations we're having with people more often than not, the energy management, the carbon management, the degassing, the metering strategies that are going on, the ability to be transparent around what is happening in the building, that's really where I'm seeing we're seeing the biggest impact of kind of a growth sector market across the industry. Is we know we've got to the point now where we need to start managing and monitoring these things, because you can't improve what you don't monitor. And I think that for a lot of people, they're mapping their net zero journey, and the software and technologies that are needed to support that is really where we're seeing the biggest drive of impact right now. Hopefully once we get to the point of those things being deployed, they're starting to work, they're starting to optimize, then I think we'll move on to the next biggest problem, which will be around that social impact and potential governance and the monitoring of that. But that's really where we're seeing most people there. The budget focus and attention is definitely on how can we reduce our footprint, our impact of the building in a cost-effective manner that's not replacing the entire facade of a building, that's not knocking it down and rebuilding it, which is probably definitely not the right answer for most people. But that's really where we're seeing the focus, and I believe will have the biggest impact on people getting the best out of what they've got today before they need to go and spend those bigger capital expenditures to get themselves to net zero.
No, I suppose a really positive outcome of that is not only the journey to net zero, but the fact that technology will have been seen to deliver a really tangible ROI and build confidence in using technology across the sector.
Yeah, I suppose in many ways the way that we look at technology is that if it's deployed properly and it's doing what it's meant to do or what it was sold to do, it should in theory give people back more time. And with that time they have, they can then go and do the other positive things, the other initiatives, the other factors of what they want to do in their day job, and human interaction, which is imperative irrespective of what sector you're working in. So yeah, hopefully there'll be the financial and carbon ROI, but then the ROI of time saved for these individuals. I mean, the number of assets we've audited that actually people are still doing manual meter readings. That is 1 or 2 days a month of a human being walking around manually writing these down, putting them in Excel and emailing them off to somebody. For us, it's just absolute madness. The deployment of an automatic meter reading means you get that time back. And what can you do with that time? Can you, spend more time talking to occupiers? Can you, reach out to a local school and bring them in? Can you, look at different types of recruitment? So yeah, that's what we hope is that technology does what it's meant to do, that gives human beings in these buildings more time to go out and do, things that ultimately technology can't do.
Yeah, and I think as a final comment, that's a positive note. I think for the whole profession is that we should see this technology as a way of freeing up time from these prosaic, fairly mundane tasks that do eat into the working day for so many professionals, and free them up to do much higher value activities. So I think it's for me a very positive view of all the technology that's out there. So Freddie, it's been fascinating to talk, and I appreciate your time. And for today, thanks ever so much, and look forward to talking to you and catching up soon.
Thanks very much.
Pleasure.